She was last seen on a warm evening in Baton Rouge, walking from her car toward the front steps of her home, unaware that a man who had been watching her for days was already moving through the shadows. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where porch lights glowed and families felt safe settling in for the night. But the moment she reached the door, something shifted behind her. A hand grabbed her, fast and deliberate, cutting off her scream before it could alert anyone. In seconds she was gone, pulled into the darkness by someone who knew how to take a woman without leaving a trace. That abduction marked one of the early breaks in a pattern law enforcement had failed to see clearly. A serial killer was operating across South Louisiana. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, women in Baton Rouge and surrounding parishes were being found murdered under violent and deeply personal circumstances. Some were discovered in rural ditches or wooded tracts. Others were left much closer to home. Detectives from different jurisdictions worked their own cases, unaware that the same man might be responsible. Louisiana had seen violence before, but the growing string of unsolved murders carried a tension residents could feel even if they hadn't yet connected the threat. The killer was Derrick Todd Lee, a man who blended into the background effortlessly. He lived in the same region as many of his victims, stood in the same checkout lines, and drove the same roads. To strangers he seemed quiet, sometimes even polite. But beneath that surface, Lee carried a history of violent behavior, assaults, break-ins, stalking complaints, that rarely resulted in consequences strong enough to stop him. Each time he slipped through the system, the danger to women around him grew. Early warnings came from women who reported a man lurking outside their windows, following them to their homes, or forcing his way inside. Their descriptions were similar, yet none of those reports led to a definitive arrest. Meanwhile, the murders continued. The victims came from different backgrounds and neighborhoods, but the evidence of violence tied their cases together. The scenes showed a killer who stalked his victims, learned their routines, and waited for a moment when they were alone. Investigators initially pursued multiple suspects. Some believed the killer was white based on early profiling theories. Others suspected more than one offender because of the variety in victim ages and backgrounds. Those assumptions slowed the investigation at critical moments. Each passing month brought another unsolved case file, another grieving family, and a growing sense of fear that gripped Baton Rouge. The investigation broke open when DNA recovered from several scenes was submitted for testing. The profile didn't match anyone in the state system, but detectives began collecting voluntary samples from hundreds of men. None matched. Then came a turning point. An out-of-state laboratory used new ancestry tools and reported that the suspect was likely African American, not white. That single correction transformed the investigation. As detectives reviewed older reports, one name resurfaced repeatedly: Derrick Todd Lee. He had been questioned before in stalking cases, including one where he forced his way into a woman's home. Detectives managed to recover a discarded DNA sample from him. When the results returned, the match was irrefutable. Lee was linked to multiple murders through genetic evidence alone. Once he realized authorities were closing in, Lee fled Louisiana. His disappearance confirmed their fears. A multi-state manhunt followed, involving local police, state investigators, and federal agents. He was eventually captured in Georgia, where he had been hiding in an attempt to escape the widening search. When he was brought back to Louisiana, the community watched, knowing the arrest was the first true moment of justice after years of terror. The evidence presented in court was overwhelming. DNA tied him directly to several murders, and additional evidence tied him to others. Families filled the courtroom as prosecutors described, in painful detail, what had happened to their daughters, mothers, and sisters. Detectives outlined their investigations step by step, recalling the long nights, the interviews, the frustration, and the determination that kept them pushing forward. Seeing Lee in shackles was the moment many families had been waiting for. Lee was convicted and sentenced to death in one case and received life sentences in others. His years on death row were uneventful compared to the chaos he had inflicted on the outside world. He died in prison in 2016 from natural causes, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would never fully heal. Families continued to mourn their loved ones, and officers who had worked the cases carried the memories of each victim with them. In the aftermath of his arrest, investigators revisited earlier incidents that had seemed unrelated at the time. Women who survived encounters with Lee described the same unsettling behavior. The way he watched them, the way he tried to force conversations, the way he appeared near their homes without reason. Some had called police, but were told little could be done. Others stayed silent out of fear. When these accounts were finally gathered into one timeline, the pattern was undeniable. Community meetings filled with anger and grief were held across Baton Rouge. Families demanded answers about why it had taken so long to identify the killer. Detectives acknowledged mistakes, especially in early assumptions about the suspect's race, which had shaped the direction of the investigation. Many wondered how many lives might have been saved had those errors not occurred. Law enforcement agencies across the state revised their protocols. The case became a model for improving data sharing, investigating stalking complaints more seriously, and expanding the use of forensic genealogy. Officers trained new recruits using the case as a teaching tool, emphasizing the importance of questioning assumptions and listening closely to victims long before tragedy strikes. The families carried the weight of their loss quietly and publicly. Some turned to advocacy, pushing for stronger protections for women. Others grieved privately, remembering birthdays, empty chairs, and the silences left behind. Even years later, the pain remained. Through every retelling, the focus stayed on the women who lost their lives, not on the man who took them. Their names, their families, and their stories remained at the center of Baton Rouge's memory. Their lives are the reason the case is studied today, and the reason the reforms that followed still matter. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.